Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the National Animal Welfare Trust's webinar on the subject of recall. Great that so many of you can join us on, well, certainly in Hertfordshire, and it's an absolutely beautiful evening. Just what you need to be doing is sitting indoors listening to a webinar, but hopefully we're going to make it worth your while, and you're going to have a really interesting hour and a half. So, first of all, I would like to introduce you to our panel. There we go. So I am your host. That is me at the top there, Claire Williams. I'm the Chief Executive of National Animal Welfare Trust. I'm also a Kennel Club accredited instructor as well, so have a little bit of knowledge on the subject, but nowhere near as much as this fantastic panel that we've got for you tonight. And we're really grateful that they have given up their time to deliver this webinar this evening. You probably know most of these guys anyway. We've got Nando Brown and Rosie Haffenden, very well-known dog trainers. They're going to introduce themselves a little bit later on, so I won't say too much, but you've probably seen them on the telly with Rescue Dog to Super Dog and Teach My Pet to Do That. And they are joined by Dean Nicholas, who's also with the School of Canine Science. And Dean is also a trainer and has a great Facebook page with Dean Nicholas and his sidekick Sid, and that's the gorgeous Sydney there as well, and he does a lot of trick training on his website, his Facebook page too. So all from the School of Canine Science, and got a really fascinating presentation for us this evening. So thank you so much, guys, for being here. So let me just explain a little bit about the technology before we go any further. For those of you that haven't attended a webinar before, or maybe forgotten how it all works, you will see slides, as you see here, and you'll hear the presenters' voices, but you will not see the presenters. That's just the way the technology works. If you've got any problems with the sound or anything like that, there is a chat box, which you should see a panel on your right-hand side, and down the bottom there's a chat box, which you can type anything in there if you do have any problems with your sound. But do bear in mind, because we're all in different locations, different speakers may require different volume controls, so just work that yourself. I will also say the guys have got some videos in their presentation, and the quality of the video is going to depend on their video, their internet connection, but also on yours. So the videos may run a little bit slow because they're a bit in the wild, so they haven't got the greatest internet connection. But any audio that you hear comes across really well. So bear with the videos, and we are actually recording the webinar, as you can see, and for the recording that we actually send to you, we will drop in the videos that actually work better. So your recording will come complete with really good videos. So just stick with us on that if that isn't quite up to scratch. With the recording, we're going to send it out to people who attended the this webinar. So all you guys who've attended, you'll get that on Thursday, and non-attendees will get it on Friday. The other thing is you can ask questions. Again, can't be done through the audio, but again in the chat box, if you want to type any question while the presenters are speaking, then we actually have some time at the end of the presentations to go through questions. So please type your questions in there at any time when it comes to you. I think that's about it on the technology, and hopefully it makes sense. But as I say, if you've got any questions, just type in the chat box, and we've got helpful people standing by who can hopefully solve your problems. We can't do anything about your internet connection, I'm afraid, though. Okay, so on with the webinar. I'm going to do a little introduction as to why we've decided to do this webinar, and some information from a survey we recently did. And then I'm going to hand over to the guys from the School of Canine Science. And that should take sort of 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll have some time for questions after that. So first of all, just let me explain a little bit about the National Animal Welfare Trust. You may not know us, or you may. We have 6 rescue and rehoming centres across the south of England, which extend from Clacton in the east all the way down to Cornwall in the west, and a number of centres in between. We rescue and rehome mainly dogs and cats, but also rabbits, guinea pigs, goats, sheep, alpacas, ducks, geese, chickens, ponies, and a number of other smaller animals as well, some birds as well. So quite a wide portfolio, but mainly cats and dogs. And like a lot of rescues, we also feel that our role is also to promote responsible pet ownership. It's not just about rescue and rehoming, and hence the reason that we occasionally run these webinars, because we think we have subjects that are important to share. We're completely funded by donations, so if you have enjoyed this webinar, please do visit our website and make a donation, and we'd be incredibly grateful. So just as a background about how all this came about. So the government last year started looking at the issue of tackling livestock worrying and particularly dog attacks. And there were quite a number of issues, particularly in more rural areas, with dogs chasing livestock and dogs attacking livestock. And out of that came, we did a little bit of work that went into this report that the government did, just about why dogs do chase livestock, and because a few people were under the misapprehension that it was because the dogs had tasted blood and things like that, but obviously, as you're going to find out, it's a little bit more than that. Also, I'm sure you've all seen on social media, there's been a huge, increase in the number of comments about people having issues with off-lead dogs running up to their reactive dogs and things like that, and that seems to be an ongoing problem. Also, when you look at dog lost or the like, then we see an increase in dogs who go missing after chasing wildlife, particularly deer. And who can forget that Fenton moment with that video that went absolutely viral with the dog chasing the deer. So sort of a mixture of all of that made us think that it'd be quite interesting to do a survey and just find a little bit more about dog owners' reactions towards recall and how they cope with their recall and what distracts their dogs and the like. So fortunately, Dogs Today magazine got on board with us, and we ran a survey earlier this year, and these are some of the results of the survey. So we had about 1,400 people respond to us, which is amazing, a really good number. And of those, about 3/4 either walked one or two dogs. So that was kind of the level. Obviously, there were people that walked a lot more dogs than that, but generally most of them walked one or two dogs. And pleasing to see that 90% of those people actually walk their dogs at least once a day. And just over 2/3, as you can see there, let their dogs off lead on most walks. So letting your dog off lead is clearly quite a big requirement when you're out walking your dog. And one of the other things we found is also that when people were considering where to walk their dogs, safety and being able to let their dogs off lead and not being near traffic and not being near livestock were really important considerations. So within that, obviously, a recall is really important. There were about 14% of people who rarely or never let their dogs off lead, sometimes because of the areas that they walked in, sometimes because they didn't have a good recall. But I think, again, the guys are going to cover and say, well, you can still give your dog a really stimulating and enriching on-lead walk if that's what you need to do. Most people who did respond said they do have a way of calling their dog back, and quite, as you see, a very large majority of them there actually using their voice as the primary method that they use to call their dogs back. Interestingly, 22% of people did say that at some stage they had a failed recall on at least one occasion. I'm sure most of us dog owners listening can agree with that we have had at least one failure. And interesting again, a very large proportion, just over 2/3, said that if they could turn the clock back, they would do more recall training and spend more time on recalling. So from all of that, we can see how important it is to train the recall and also to have a good recall. We also asked people what were their dog's biggest distractions. And you can see there in that little diagram that the biggest distraction people found were cats, followed by other dogs, and then a variety of wildlife, squirrels being the wildlife of choice by the looks of it for a lot of dogs, and way down there to humans, other people being quite low on the list, along with cows and horses. So quite interesting to see where the biggest distractions come from, and certainly from some of the questions we've already had in. other dog seems to be a massive distraction for dogs. We also asked a few interesting questions around how people felt when other people's dogs, when other people couldn't call their dogs back to them, and what happened when the tables were turned. And I do like that cartoon there, which I thought was worth putting in. So first of all, people sort of said, when the dog doesn't come back, just under half of people said they do actually worry about what the consequences are going to be. It may be that they're going to get into a bit of a fracas with another dog. It may be the dog runs off. It may be they're near traffic. So people were quite worried about the consequences of it. And if they had an incident where their dog didn't come back from another dog, a third of people said that the owner of the other dog was fine. But only 3% said that the owner had been abusive to them if that had happened. However, interestingly, when you reverse that situation, so say another owner's dog was running up to their dog, 11% actually said they'd be really angry. So you kind of compare that to the 3% the other way around. And then we asked people, what was the other owner doing when their dog was running off towards your dog? And in a third of cases, most people felt other owners were completely oblivious to the situation. So you can see there that how attitudes differ to the recall, whether you're the dog owner or your dog's running up to another dog. But also, again, it's a source of tension out on walks, and sometimes, it does prevent people walking their dogs perhaps as much as they would do, because they don't want to end up in these sorts of situations. We then actually looked at some of the consequences. I do love that picture of that dog with its head in the picnic basket. And 19%, so that's quite a high percentage, said they had experienced some sort of consequence when they've been trying to call their dog back. And actually, of that 19%, quite a large proportion, over two-thirds, said that it had actually resulted in an injury to their dog by another dog. So that's really interesting. And I know there's been other research out there as well saying that, there is an increase in dogs being injured by other dogs when they're running up to them and the owner hasn't been able to call them back. And again, interestingly, 20% of people who responded said that they have had to take their dog to the vet as a result of an injury whilst the dog was off lead, and that varied from running it through barbed wire, stick-related injuries from other dogs, cutting pads and things like that. Quite a variety of injuries as well. Some of which I guess they could have called their dogs back from, some of them maybe not. So, there is a risk as well out there, which people were honest enough to share with us. Now on to a slightly more controversial subject, but important to put in because we did get responses to the survey. And this is the subject of e-collars. And I know this will start a few people's blood boiling, but I think it's important we do share this information because 6% of people who responded to the survey said that they use an e-collar for training the recall, and the majority of those said that since training with the e-collar, they'd actually had no instances when the dog didn't come back to them, and they felt that actually by doing that training, it gave the dog off-lead freedom that it wouldn't otherwise have had. And some of the e-collar users said that they use it as a backup if the voice command actually fails. So the dog wears it, but the dog will come back by voice, but they've got it there as a backup if it fails. But others said the dog no longer needs to wear the collar because of the training that it's had. So we wanted to put that in because it was part of the survey. But I would say, as you can see that note at the bottom, that the National Animal Welfare Trust supports a ban on e-collar, not only on e-collars but also on electronic containment fence systems. So we're not agreeing with this. We're just putting it out there because it was part of the survey results, and we think it's important to share. So then we just ask people some questions about how they trained the recall, and as you can see there, most people, 2/3 of people taught the recall themselves, and just over 20% of people actually sought help from a professional to teach their dog how to recall. And there, just over half of people said that if the recall fails, the first thing they think about is that they should have done some more training with their dog. But equally, a third of people actually said, well, if the recall fails, it's just the dog doing its own thing, it's following its own instincts, and it's doing what it really enjoys. So again, you know, some people had a much more relaxed attitude towards their dog not coming back to them, which is absolutely fine. So then, just to summarize on that, these are some of the comments we got back, and I think these kind of are great summaries. So someone said recall should be practiced every day and rewarded for life. So recognizing there that this isn't just something you train and tick a box and that's that, it's ongoing training. Another person said recall is never 100%, and safe off-lead walks are about making risk assessments every time you walk, which I think is a really valid comment as well. So it's not just about having good recall, but it's also about being aware of the environment. And as one person did say, you should ban people from talking on their phones whilst they're walking their dogs. Again, another comment that new dog owners perhaps don't understand the training and the time that it takes to teach a good recall. And I think this is something that we'll probably come back to again during the course of the evening, that it does take time to teach a good recall, but it's time well invested. And I think that also then goes back to the whole usage of e-collars, because for a lot of people, an e-collar is a quick fix rather than putting in the time to train. It's not necessarily, you know, it's not a good fix, but it's a quick fix. So I think that's quite an interesting juxtaposition as well. And then finally, a really great quote there. I think, you know, letting your dog off a lead is a privilege, not a right. And if the dog's not trained, it should not be let off the lead. And I think a lot of people would absolutely agree with that. So just some really great comments there that came out of the research that I think you'd all agree with. So that's just a very quick summary of some of the things we found, and the reason why we wanted to run this webinar, because I think we need to look a little bit deeper into some of these issues. So that's it from me. I'm now going to hand over to Nando, Jo, Rosie and Dean, who are going to look at the whole subject in a lot more depth. Right, over to you guys.
Hi. Rosie.
Hello guys, my name's Nando Brown.
And I'm Dean Nicholas.
And I think we're going to do something a little bit different this time. I think we're going to introduce each other, which will be fun.
That'll be fun.
So sitting next to me, to my left, is Nando Brown, the Nando Brown. He is an ex-Royal Marine Commando and an ex-semi-professional cage fighter, and he's very handsome. I can say that because he is also my partner and baby daddy. So he's the founder of the World Scent Dog Association. So he kind of rebought competitive scent work back to the UK. He also co-published 2 books with me and co-presented 2 TV shows with me. His specialisms, if you like, his mastermind topics would probably be bite work as well as scent work, because those are the things that he's really interested and passionate about. And at the moment, he's training his Malinois Fizz to compete in Mondio ring sport, as well as our new spaniel to do some competitive scent work.
Brilliant. Okay, so I get the pleasure of introducing Jo Rosie. So for those of you that don't know Jo, Jo is the behaviourist in our group with a really, really strong academic background. So she's got postgraduate education in animal behaviour and degrees in applied psychology. She's got her name on 3 published books, 2 TV series, and she's competed at European level in canine athletics. She's currently training her Malinois Blake to compete in Mondio ring, and she is co-founder of the School of Canine Science.
The handsome chap that you can see on the screens right now. He has a master's degree in business, but I know him from judging one of his entries in a trick competition in Wales, where he absolutely destroyed the competition, to the point where I had to go and have a word with him afterwards and ask if he was a dog trainer, because I thought he was cheating. But actually he wasn't. At the time, he was a dog owner, and his level of skill was like something I had never seen in a pet owner before. He's now a fully qualified he's a fully qualified super dogs instructor, force-free trick training instructor. He's got specialist interest in dog tricks, precision behaviours, and support dog behaviours. But I'm going to pull out that precision behaviours bit, because the way that Dean trains is much sharper, much more precision based than either myself or Jo. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, it is impeccable.
Yeah, very, very highly skilled. If you get the opportunity, go and have a look at his Facebook page, because you'll see some awesome training happening.
Because a lot of people don't understand, but there can be some really good reasons for this.
Yeah, so you know, it's a legit reason if you have a dog like Archie. As you can see on the screen here, we've got a legally registered pit bull, and by law he has to stay on lead when he is out in public. So legit, there's nothing you can do about that. But there are other reasons, as Claire went through in the survey, that dogs don't get the opportunity to go off lead, and one of those is a poor recall. For me, that is not a good enough answer.
Yeah, so you've got deafness, you've got blindness, you've got noise phobias that might be a little bit more concrete as reasons. But if you consider the study was of 1,400 dogs and only 68% of those get let off lead, that's almost 500 dogs, or 448 to be precise, that don't get let off lead on a regular basis. So, and we're not talking about those moments where we're around livestock or next to the road. We're talking full time. Those dogs don't get let off lead.
Absolutely, and I've trained some wicked deaf dogs and blind dogs, really, really awesome recalls. You've got to think outside the box a little bit, but there's no reason why those dogs can't either be given decent training so that they can come back when they're called, or else at least the owners can find brilliant areas to let the dogs off lead. There's loads of secure fields around that you can hire, and there's nothing wrong with going to your local farmers or your local landowners and asking them permission to walk on their land. I've done that absolutely tons with my pit bull Archie.
You also got that halfway house, so on lead or on lead, but you've got long lines, and they can get all sorts of distances. You can drop your long line eventually. So we're not quite sure whether some of those dogs that don't get out regularly or don't get off their lead regularly are making use of long lines.
Yeah, and the long lines, you can get like 40-foot long lines as well. So as much as they're a little bit of a nightmare to handle, and even with the legal reasons for having a dog on lead, there's nothing legally that stipulates that you have to have your dog on a short lead. There's nothing to say that you can't have your dog on a long line. And actually, I wrote to DEFRA, and they came back and said that yes, you can have your dog on a long line.
Well, for me, I think freedom is a massive part of having a happy dog. Having that dog off lead, allowing it to perform natural behaviours and really stretch its legs makes a massive difference to quality of life.
Yeah, so there's nothing like watching your dog prance around, chase around, sniff things, demonstrate lots and lots of their natural behaviours that they wouldn't otherwise get to demonstrate on a lead.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. And if you look at the 5 freedoms, which is part of the animal welfare legislation, actually one of them is allowing the dog to have the ability to practice natural behaviours. And I think that that's probably in there specifically referencing off lead, I think, because I think that there are lots of natural behaviours that it's very, very difficult for a dog to practice on lead.
That said, if you're in a situation where you have a perfectly legitimate reason not to let your dog off lead, it doesn't mean that they're not happy or that you can't make their life happy. It just could be more enriching with some time off lead.
Yeah, I agree. There are things that we can do to, if you have one of them dogs like Archie, for instance, who's our pit, then there are things you can do to make their life better.
It's just a bit more hard work, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. You have to put more effort in.
It usually involves taking gear out with you or thinking outside the box or going to places.
So just like humans, you're going to maintain a healthier heart and circulation, as well as keeping dogs at healthier weight, as well as preventing UTIs, increasing the immune system because they're going to roll around in all kinds of different good germs, and reducing the likelihood of doggy depression, just like exercise does with humans. However, there is a flip side to this, and often trainers and behaviourists and dog owners can use exercise or attempt to use exercise with dogs that are showing problem behaviours to attempt to exhaust them or wear them out. And you guys will back me up here, that's not always the best.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been in plenty of situations where you walk in and you've got a massively aroused dog, and like the dog trainer before you has highly recommended that you go out and exercise your dog more, give it more, give it more, give it more. And all you end up doing is training a canine athlete, really.
Yeah, and to that kind of standard with athletics, he was an absolute arse to live with.
So I would definitely say there have been cases that I've had to go and see where they've had to tone down what they're doing. Either they take the dog out every single day and they just spend a full hour with a chuck it and a ball, launching that down a hill, and the dog comes running back up, because for the first week it absolutely exhausted their dog. But of course, as you progress through that, the dog's going to get fitter and fitter, and you're never going to keep up. Now, that is the minority in comparison to the amount of people that don't walk their dogs enough, though, in fairness, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are some really important natural behaviours that dogs display when they're out and about. And this kind of can be categorised into 3 intrinsic motivators. And when we're talking about intrinsic motivation, we're talking about the dogs that have got like an inbuilt desire to perform certain categories of behaviours. So one of them is to explore, and this is being enriched in terms of their scent, in terms of their sight, in terms of touch, in terms of all this stuff, in different textures, well, socially, and birth, want to explore their environment. So to master is another intrinsically motivated behaviour. It's a behaviour that it's a desire that the dog is born with, is to master particular skills, and that can really change from dog to dog. So in the video you saw Ella mastering stalking. She's a Hunt Point Retriever, so she's bred to stalk. She'll stalk birds in the park, but she'll stalk like statues of things, and sometimes things like crisp packets as well. And she does this because this is something she was born with, the desire to master this certain part of hunting behaviour, because that's how she's been bred. And different dogs have got different desires to master different behaviours, but this is definitely a natural and a very important part of natural behaviour. And some of those behaviours, it's very, very difficult for them to master in a garden that they're in all the time. Things like picking up novel scents, following novel tracks, chasing things that are moving. Those things that they've got an intrinsic desire to master, when they don't get given an outlet for that, can often leak out in unhealthy behaviour, such as chasing cars or stalking kids, and that kind of thing.
Now, I will add to this one and say that usually this is to do with predation, and it can be a massive distraction. So trying to call your dog away while they're doing this can be really difficult, but that needs to be part of any training plan, any recall training plan that you put in place. You want to be building up to these intrinsic motivators to be able to call them away, because we can actually harness that and use it as one of our rewards if it's appropriate.
Yeah, we'll come back to that later on.
Okay, so what you saw there is Blake running and splashing, and what we're talking about is the offering the animal the opportunity to experience physical stimulation. Now, of course, we can take Blake to the water on a lead and then, ask him to go and swim, and we can take him into a field and let him explore that. But what we're talking about here is giving Blake the choice. So he's off lead. He can go in the water if he wants to. He can go up on the grass verge if he wants to. He can run around and chase birds if he wants to. But it's that choice element of what his body is in a state to experience.
Absolutely, and this can be quite hard, especially if you live in a built-up urban area and you're walking your dog on lead, because a walk round the estate on the lead is not going to give the dog the opportunity for the physical stimulation that it requires. And particularly in certain types of dogs and certain individuals that have a really high drive, a real need for this sort of physical stimulation. Again, it's another thing that can very easily leak out into unhealthy behaviours when they're not given a natural outlet. Grazing, which can massively benefit the dog's immune system, because they're getting all these different types of grasses and these different microbes from different bits of dirt and stuff that they actually need, that's going to keep them healthy, as well as digging, and as well as scent, which Nando will come on to in a second. But these are sorts of behaviours that we can spend quite a lot of time trying to discourage our dog from doing, particularly when they're on lead. So if you're walking a dog on lead and they start eating the grass, or they start digging, or they start sniffing, it can be really frustrating and annoying. But when they're off lead, we tend to give them a lot more of an opportunity to partake in these behaviours. And just like the other behaviours that we mentioned a moment ago, it's important to remember that these are really natural behaviours that the dog is going to be born with some sort of an intrinsic motivation to perform.
nose is so powerful that trying to override that can become a real big problem. Let me give you an example. So for a human has 5 million scent receptors in their nose, okay? And a average German Shepherd will have around 225 million scent receptors.
It's loads, isn't it?
So the way that they perceive the world is completely different to how a human is going to perceive it. So sometimes when a dog is mid-sniff and you think they're just being a pain in the backside, they're not just ignoring you or being stubborn. In fact, many times they physically cannot hear you because they're so engrossed in the scent.
Their whole brain is developed for scent. So they've got a massive olfactory bulb, haven't they? And they've got the ability to smell emotions, really, because with pheromones and stuff, they can tell whether or not another dog is aroused, or whether or not that dog is in heat, or whether or not that dog, depending on almost the mood of the dog. So if we can just almost try to imagine that we can see the past, so we can see where people have walked and what people have done before us, where someone might have put a sandwich down. We can even see, to some extent, the future, because we can see the dogs coming over and what kind of mood they're in before any level of actual physical body language and communication takes place. So that must be an insane world to live in if you could live inside the nose of a dog, right?
Yeah, I think it's Nando's statistic, but if a dog's nose scent was human vision, they could see from New York to London. Is that right?
That's right. That's bang on.
That's crazy.
Nuts, isn't it? Imagine that. Imagine being able to see on a clear day from London to New York.
Yeah, I mean that is an amazing statistic. It's an amazing analogy, but it just gives you a brief kind of insight into their world. And many times when we're saying that that dog is being stubborn, it's not being stubborn. It literally is. It's so focused on something else that it's not hearing you properly.
Yeah, just the sheer amount of information they're gathering and collecting at that single point in time.
Yeah.
Imagine the world. Imagine a walk down the road like that. And I think sometimes we underestimate the different scents in urban areas as well. We think about the countryside and we think about all the grasses and the ground and stuff. But actually, when you think about the urban areas with the bins and with people having walked there and stuff, there's some nuts scents everywhere.
If you have a dog that is having to live its life on lead, this is one option, a way that you can mentally stimulate the dog, because mental stimulation is sometimes much more important than physical stimulation. If Fizz goes out on the track, for instance, she is shattered when she comes home.
Yeah, it blows my mind. So Fizz is Nando's Malinois. And so she's a really energetic dog, naturally. In fact, if we take her out on the walk, I'm sure you'll agree that sometimes she comes home and she's actually higher and more excitable than if she hasn't gone on a walk at all. And yet, if you take her out tracking for a quarter of the time that you would have walked with her, she comes back and she's just absolutely knackered out.
Yeah, I mean, I see it all the time, and I quite welcome the challenge actually when people go, oh, I can't tie my dog, I walk my dog for miles and miles and miles, I just can't tie my dog, and then 20 minutes into a training exercise their dog's completely blown out and wiped out on the side. So engaging the brain and the nose is often far more tiring and far more stimulating than just engaging in exercise.
And just a tip for owners as well is that it doesn't have to be really hard training that you do with a professional trainer, does it?
No, not at all. Just throwing treats out into the garden, it starts the nose off. They start scavenging, and that would be mentally stimulating for the dog.
Yeah, you can move from that to then hiding some treats in a few little piles around on one of your walks, or in a field, train some tricks, do some basic obedience. Or
one of my favourites, which is walking and then just dropping the toy as you're walking somewhere, and then turning around and allowing the dog to go and find the toy ready for another game. I love that, and it's so easy.
But just like all training, you have to do that step by step. So if you're going to drop the toy, do a couple of steps before you ask the dog to find it. Don't walk half a mile and then turn around and go, where's your toy? Okay, it's all about progression. But if you go back to the thought about the power of the dog's nose and the power of scent, you are either going to fight against that, or you can harness it and use it to benefit your dog's life.
And I think that goes for so much behaviour. You know, even if we delve into specific types of dogs and specific even breeds of dog, we can think about certain dogs have been artificially selected for a really long time to perform particular behaviours. It doesn't just have to be about scent, it might be about chase, or it might be about bite, or it might be about, you know, grabbing something and pulling it. And depending on where the dogs come from, what they've been bred to do originally, often that can mean that the dogs have a real desire to perform particular behaviours, and sometimes that can lead to trouble. Sometimes those are the behaviours that they are running away to do when they are not listening to the recall. And then very often, if we use those as a reward for a good recall, then that's how you're gonna change the behaviour of your dog.
Yeah, and we know every dog is an individual, and that not all dogs will act the same. But the breed gives us a really good signal into the kind of problems you might get with your recall. So if you ask me who's more likely to chase, a beagle or a collie, I'm going to say a collie. Okay, not all collies, but most collies. If you ask me who's more likely to naff off following a scent trail, your beagle is far more likely than your collie.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point, because if you do research, they usually had some kind of purpose that they've been bred for in the first place. And a lot of people will see that as a problem. They'll see that their dog has a really powerful nose like the beagle. But again, if you harness that, you can use that as your reward. Or if you have a dog that likes to chase like a collie, then using chase as your reward is going to make all the difference.
Yeah, find out what your dog has been bred to really enjoy on a biological level, and then try and do it with him as opposed to letting him do it without you. I think that's definitely my top tip when it comes to thinking about how to reward a dog for a recall, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the other point is, don't forget about breed lines.
Yeah.
So not all German Shepherds are working German Shepherds. You know, you've got show lines in there as well. So when you look at somebody else's German Shepherd really calm down the park and yours quite isn't, maybe you've got a different line of dog, and it's worth doing a little bit of work into the history, a little bit of research to find out the kind of German Shepherd that you've got.
Most definitely. And we all see trends. I mean, in 15 years of working with dogs, I've definitely seen breed trends. It would be foolish to completely ignore them. And I think that when we're selecting dogs, we can be clever by checking out, even if we don't know that dog, even if we can't get a brilliant assessment of that dog because they're in a rescue kennel, for example, then we can be a bit smart and we can check the line that that dog comes from, as in whether or not it's a working or a show type dog, and we can check what that breed was originally bred to do, and that will usually give you some indication as to what problem behaviour, if any, will likely to occur. So for example, if you pick up a Malinois, then your problem behaviour is more likely to be linked around biting, whereas if you pick up a beagle, it's more likely to be linked around scenting.
Don't pick up a Malinois. just don't do it.
He says that now after he's convinced me to get one. So training a recall, and how we would suggest that every owner and probably every trainer starts in terms of recall training.
Yeah, I think it's really important that you're clear. Okay, training becomes a lot easier as soon as you have a line of communication to your dog that you can tell them what's right and what's wrong. But before you get there, you have to work out what exactly a recall is.
In a sentence, then how the hell do you expect the dog to do it?
What's your recall?
So my recall is immediate disengagement from whatever he's chasing or following or interested in, running at full pace back to me, return to heel, and to maintain that position until I say, go play.
Nando?
So I have a few different exercises that I use for my recall. One is to run back full pelt and touch my hand with their nose. Another one would be to come in between my legs. Or another one would be to return to my left-hand side. So I wouldn't necessarily say Fluffy come, especially as I don't have a dog called Fluffy. But I might say touch, or I might say middle, or I might say close. What about you?
So most of my dogs have two different ones. So the first one is my kind of security blanket, if in case of emergency recall, and that is a whistle recall to the middle position in the middle of my legs. And when I whistle, I expect the dog to return swiftly at a really quick pace. I will always pay him for that recall, and I'll only ever use it if either I think he's definitely going to succeed, because I want to build a really big history of that dog being reinforced for coming back when he hears the whistle, or if it's an absolute emergency. Other than that, I have a voice cue, and the dog has to touch my hand. But I won't always pay that, if I'm completely honest. When they touch my hand, they're able to disengage straight away afterwards. When the dog comes into the middle position, they have to wait till they're released.
So it's about having that strict criteria. It's about the dog understanding what it is it has to do. So when we say come, and the dog just turns up, okay, if you're not clear about what it is that you're going to reward, it becomes really difficult. So just think that through to yourselves now. If your dog runs up to you, but he's 6 foot away from you, is that acceptable? If your dog bimbled back to you slowly, would that be okay? So if you have a clear description of what the behavior is, it becomes much easier to tell the dog that they've got it right or not, and then that will start to improve.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to kind of 3 things, doesn't it? It comes down to what your cue is going to be, what you expect when you say that cue, what behaviour there is, and then how you then release that dog back out into the wild.
So signals. So what's your signal for your main recall?
Whistle.
Okay, and then you've got a voice signal as well?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Which is the dog's name followed by here.
Cool. Nando, what's your signal?
So I have a couple. One is close, one is touch, and one is middle.
Cool.
What about you?
Yeah, thanks. So I've got 3. So the first one is a whistle, and that's the recall that I'll pay every time. That's my emergency recall. I'll practice it once or twice a walk. The boy's getting paid no matter what, as long as he comes back and meets criteria. I've also got pop up, which means turn around and look at me. So give me a level of engagement so that I can ask something of you. That might be come, or that might be sit, or that might be stand. And I've also got this way, and this way means, you know, you're probably best to follow me. You can continue sniffing. I'm not that bothered if you don't turn away and disengage immediately, but I'm going over here, and it's probably a good idea if you do the same.
It's funny, isn't it? Because we've all, well, a lot of trainers have got a real pet hate in using the dog's name. I use my dog's name in lots of different situations. And what that means to my dog when I say Blake or Ella or Archie is look at me, engage with me, and I'm going to tell you what to do. So I will use their name in recall, but I will say their name and expect them to be listening to me, and then ask them to come here or give them the next cue. Why don't we like generally people using the dog's name as the recall cue?
Well, for me, it's just because the name is used so many other times. So in the house, you know, stop doing that, Fluffy, or, you know, Fluffy, get over here, or time for Fluffy's dinner, or Fluffy, time to go out. It just means so many other things to the dog that I think they may struggle a little bit to separate and discriminate that word from in isolation from other words.
Yeah, I think as long as you're consistent, we know that dogs can learn context, but you do have to be really consistent. So at the beginning of training, I think it's a good idea not to use a name. I think it's a better idea to have a clear cue or a clear signal for a clear behaviour. Okay, but in the long run, they totally can understand the differences in your tone and even understand the words that we're saying to a certain extent.
But I think I prefer the dog's name as a look at me, as an engagement,
100%,
rather than me come to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you know what? I think that's a really important part of recall training. It's just attention,
focus. Yeah, switch on.
Because teaching that focus, as I was saying earlier about the scent being a massive distraction, if we can build up to a level where they're mid-sniff and you say their name and they disengage from that scent and look at you, the training becomes a hell of a lot easier.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the puppy course that we're building at the moment, it's all around that engagement aspect when we start training the recall.
Absolutely. Engagement is one of the most important things for me.
Yeah, especially around distractions. So getting the puppy or the dog to be able to disengage with something else in order to engage with you, I think is the foundations to appropriate behaviour out and about in public. If we just think of a little aside for the moment and think about those stats that Claire talked about at the beginning, with dogs running over to other dogs, I think a lot of that stems from a problem with focus. The dog isn't engaged enough with the owner to have an ear out on what they're doing, and is looking for entertainment elsewhere often, I think.
Well, yeah, and it's part of the learning process, teaching the dog to disengage, to turn its head away from something, to pay attention to you.
Although a caveat of that might be that different dogs have got kind of a natural, we talked about this the other day, didn't we, a natural kind of petability, like a natural, a natural, how good they are at making decisions to do things that we humans find socially appropriate. So we have 6 dogs, and they massively range in terms of that kind of petability. We've got dogs like Archie, and on a walk, if Archie wasn't registered pit bull and he was without muzzle and without lead, his behaviour, if he wasn't engaged with me 90% of the time, would be really inappropriate. He would pick up stones because he's got a bit of kind of like doggy OCD, if you like. He would completely torment other dogs because his social behaviour can be quite inappropriate. He desires physical stimulation with other dogs in a way that other dogs don't really like. It would be really, really inappropriate. So I have to keep on top of him and his recall, but also his engagement has to be a lot more because he's that way inclined. Whereas Ella or Zeus,
they're much more easygoing, aren't they? Ella and Zeus are much more laid back. But I think in terms of people struggling with their own dogs and their recall, a lot of this is accidentally trained, because what they do is they let the dog off the lead and get the phone out.
Yeah,
and then
the
dog learns to find its own amusement. The dog learns to what works. They say, all right, when I'm off lead, Dad ignores me. So I go and do my own thing. If you don't give the dog a job to do, it will go self-employed.
Yeah, and the walk is like one of the main times in your day that you get to spend quality time with your dog. Like for a lot of owners, that's their after walk, their after work, their 40 minutes where actually they're putting everything else aside and they're going out with that dog. So they need to actually go out with that dog and not go out with their phone.
Yeah, so if you're not going to choose to engage with the dog, you'd rather engage with Facebook than expect the dog to engage with you.
Yeah, absolutely. He's going to be off checking his own female. So
yeah,
why is he going to chin it to you? So I think it's really important, and it is the most important part of the day for our dog as well. Because, you know, a lot in the real world, a lot of us go to work, long hours, okay, dog's on his own at home or with his playmates, but he's stuck inside the house for the majority of the day. When you do finally go to take him out for a walk, that's your chance to just engage.
Make his it can possibly be.
Absolutely. And if you're one of those people that's going out with your dog and your dog is not fussed about you, make the effort. Okay, and tap into what it is that turns your dog on, okay, and you'll find that they come back much quicker on a regular basis.
Let's talk about what our target behaviours are for our dogs. So I'm going to start. So I've got 3 dogs, and Blake, my big fluffy Malinois, likes to come in between my legs when I call him back. Archie likes to touch my hand when I call him back, and Ella she likes to come into the close position when I call her back. So my target behaviours are different for different dogs, and that's because different dogs find different behaviours stimulating. Nando?
So I've got several different target behaviours, as I was saying. One is to touch my hand, like Archie's doing in this, and I think that's a really clear target behaviour, because either they touch it or they don't.
Yeah.
You know, it's right or it's wrong. Now we can add different parameters onto the back of that. Do they have to do it from 3 steps away, or do they have to do it from 300 steps away? Do they have to do it within 5 seconds? You know, so do they have to do it in the middle of a circus? Probably don't walk your dog in the middle of a circus and let it off lead. But those things have to be thought about.
But those are elements on the criteria, aren't they? So touching the hand is the base criteria. That's the pressure at which, the distance at which, the duration for which, the distraction of which are criteria upon that. And we'd advise you to build those gradually and build those sensibly for your dog. So if your dog likes to chase, probably don't start training recall in the middle of a field of sheep.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. And what about you? What's your target behaviour for Sid?
So heel on the left-hand side. So I've got other behaviours as well. So I've got the middle position, I've got a hand touch, and I've got a sort of a close sit in front of me, watch me cue as well. But I don't use those explicitly for recall. I might use those for other things.
I think another really nice one that I love for little dogs is a foot target.
Yeah,
I think they're really underused, because when you've got a little tiny dachshund or something, you're calling it back, you don't bend down with your hand each time, and so a foot target can be brilliant for those little dogs.
Yeah, so what you mean by a foot target is a dog coming up and either touching your foot with its paw, or even its nose.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how long do you expect the dog to stay with you after you've called it back?
Oh, that's a good question.
That's a great question. So I don't expect the dog to keep its nose on my hand for any length of time. As long as they touch it, that's good. But what I expect as soon as they come off my hand is to focus on me, okay? So that I can either give them another cue, give them a signal to do something else, maybe sit, maybe give them a treat, maybe just to engage and play with them, or I might just release them, like, right then, you're done, off you go.
Yeah.
Depends on the behaviour. So if my dog's coming back to touch my hand, then absolutely they can touch my hand and off they go. If I'm whistle recalling so that they're coming into the middle position between my legs, then I'll usually feed them for being there, and keep them there for longer until I release them with the word okay.
Yeah, and that's a nice point there. There's a little tip there in what Joe just said, which is use food on a schedule. So keep feeding your dog randomly and intermittently for being next to you until you're ready for them to leave. And what you'll end up with is a dog that hovers around you for much, much, much longer until you go, that's it, the food's over, mate, go and be a dog.
Yeah, really good idea.
If you take your dogs walking in a environment like this, which is really highly distracting, one of the most important tips for recall is to make sure that you've got the right value of reward with you. If your dog is chasing squirrels or sniffing, really, really interesting smells, then trying to call them back for a dry biscuit is just not going to cut it. But making sure you've got the right reinforcers on you, or rewards on you, will make all the difference. Hello, Bella! Juice, close! Hello. Hey, how's it going? So today, I've got chicken hearts. And these are high value stuff that they wouldn't normally get. Okay, off you go then. Got to go off. But next time I might get something a bit different out, and I've got liver treats. Good boy. Go on then, off you go. You'll see they'll hang around because this is where all the good stuff happens. Hello, Bella. Hello, darling. Good girl. Juice, close. Woohoo. You get a bit bigger than that, can't you? There you go. For you. Okay, let's go. So make sure when you're out on a walk, you've got the right rewards with you. Off you go, guys. Apologies on that. On the one day that we need Sky to play the ball, they've decided to let us down. So if you can't get access to that video, I believe it will be all sorted for when the presentation is emailed out to you afterwards. Any problems with that, we will sort it out, so don't worry about that. I do apologize about that, but basically what that video is saying is make sure that you go out with something suitable to reward your dog with. Okay, if I go out to a really distracting environment like the woods, I'm not expecting my dog to come back for one piece of dry kibble. Okay, dry piece of dog food.
It might work the first time, but it sure as hell won't work the second time when you realise they just come off a really strong scent that they were finding fascinating for your crappy bit of kibble.
Yeah.
And I've got a real pet hate here, which is that I see people overusing food rewards for recall. And I was that you want to reward the dog with the sort of energy that you want the dog to have in a behaviour. And by that, I mean, if you want the dog to run back with real speed and lots of energy, then you need to put that speed and energy into your reward as well. So for me, when it comes to recall, for any dogs that are really interested in toys, that is what I'm going to use.
Yeah, and I mean, I started by using food to train my recall because I could get lots of reps in quite a short space of time, and that worked with Sydney to a greater extent for most things. So calling him back off people, calling him back when he's investigating a bush or another dog. But the second you start to get involved in anything predatory, so little furries that are running around the woods, be it squirrels or rabbits, then your couple of bits of kibble or even your couple of bits of sausage or even a little bit of steak might not be as reinforcing for the dog as the chase and the potential of catching that little furry. So at that point, that's where you really want to spice it up. So you really want to bring in something that hits on those little internal intrinsic reinforcers of the dog. So for Sydney, that also would be chasing a tuggy when he comes back to me, a little bit of combat with me for the tuggy, so he gets to kill the tuggy. Then I let him win the tuggy and he parades it around. And then what Sydney will do is then pin it to the floor and pluck it. And if I left him there to pluck it, he'd pluck it till it didn't have a single bit of fur left on it. But he loves it. Absolutely loves it. Do you guys use similar sorts of things?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a real take-home message for everybody listening, and it's the kind of thread throughout the whole of this. That if you research what the dog was bred to do and what the dog wants to do, the part of that predatory action sequence, that hunting sequence that the dog enjoys, use that as a reward when your dog comes back to you, because likelihood is that big distraction, that Achilles heel that makes the dog run away, is performing an element of that behavior. So if he can perform that behavior with you as a reliable part of his reward when he comes back, he's much more likely to come back. So for Archie, who was originally bred to bait bulls and bears and run underneath and grab the hold of their faces, Tuggy, without a doubt, is the one thing that he would do anything. Ella, it's a retrieve, she's a gun dog, and for my Mally, yep, it's biting the toy.
Yeah, I think the analogy that I like to use when I'm explaining this to other instructors or to pet owners is that if you think about your dog running off after a squirrel being the equivalent of £1 million, and they come back and you offer them one piece of kibble, you're saying, I want you to leave £1 million to come back for 50p. That just will not cut it. How many times would you do it? I can tell you now, if you asked me to leave £1 million and you were going to offer me even a fiver, I'm going to tell you to poke it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also about having a real think about the kind of hierarchy of reward. So what is £1 million and what is 50p and everything in between, so that if your dog is come off a deer to come back to you, you make sure you pay him £1 million. But if he has trotted back to you very slowly off something that isn't that important, like just a little bit of grass that he was munching away on, that's a good time to give him that fiver.
You can also use functional reinforcers as well. So for example, if I've called my dog back off another dog, just rewarding the dog with the ability to go and play with that dog again can serve as reinforcement for the coming back behaviour to us.
Yeah, that's a great one.
That's a massively underused one. However, you have to make sure this is appropriate and the other dog wants to play, because they get into a scrap and all of a sudden you're in the red.
But as someone who lives with a full pack of 6 dogs, it's nice to practice that. We practice that on walks all the time, calling dogs out from play with the other dogs. If you live in a multi-household, otherwise you can often get kind of almost not over bonding, but dogs that don't have any real need to come back to you and work with you because they can go out and work with the other dogs in the household. So if you do have multi-dogs, calling those dogs out of play from each other, even in the house as well as out and about, is definitely going to help your recall when you are outside and there are other dogs around. And
just like we've been saying, this is a step-by-step process. This isn't you just waiting for your dog to play for 5 minutes and get really ramped up, chasing around a 4-acre field after dogs, and then shouting, Fluffy, come, and expecting him to come back, because that ain't going to happen. So you need to build this in little increments, but you need to practice it.
as the guy said earlier, this has got to be part of a plan. So the same way that you're building a hierarchy of what your dog finds rewarding, you want to think about what the dog finds distracting and start on the easier distractions and work up. So me personally, I like to train my recall behaviours in the kitchen while I'm waiting for the kettle to boil over a week before I then take them outside. And lastly, somewhere like a park or a woods where all those things that I know that my dogs will find really distracting live.
Yeah, I mean, a simple little test for you is if you want to get your dog back from another dog or another human who's got a ball thrower in their hand and is playing with their dog and you're struggling with that, is if you can't call your dog back off one of their toys, you stand absolutely no hope of getting it back off somebody else's.
Absolutely. So distractions, work them in, but work them in slowly. And my other little hat tip here goes for dog trainers. If you're a dog owner and you really can't get it, you're really struggling, sometimes it requires a level of professional help. And you know what, I promise you it's worth it, because the more control you have over your dog in public, the more freedom that dog gets to come with you and do stuff with you.
And the more proud you can be of them. For me, there's nothing better than standing in the middle of the dog park and your dog being the dog that's under control, your dog being the dog that will come back, your dog being the well-behaved dog.
Yeah.
And if you are a dog trainer and you're listening to this, there's no better way to get business than walking the walk.
Oh God, yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. Make sure your dog's recall is reliable. And the other thing about dog training is I think it's one of those behaviours that actually there's nothing wrong with getting the dog trainer to train it for you and just hand it over.
Yeah, that's one of the behaviours that can actually be quite easily trained by somebody else with a higher skill set.
Yeah.
And then hand it over to you.
Especially if you use a whistle or something that doesn't have any emotionality attached.
That's a luxury of a dog owner. If I was a dog owner, I'd definitely do that. Your dog's nemesis, that's the last thing that you're going to train that dog on. So if your dog is chasing, then you need to make sure your recall is absolutely impeccable down the park off other dogs before you take them somewhere where you know there are rabbits.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so for me, I'm going to start this one off because Zeus was always a bugger when it came to chasing squirrels. And I used that functional reward of the ability to go out and actually hunt for squirrels once I knew they were safe as a reward if he came away from them. Now, that's all well and good and worked quite nicely. We didn't, no squirrels were harmed in the making of this training, but he went and stayed with my sister for 1 week where she happily let him chase squirrels at the end of the garden, and that training had to go back into place. So it's not one of those things that just because the dog has learned it before that it's finished.
Oh, that's a good point. Let's pick up on that quickly, which is recall's never a done deal. Okay, never. So the less you work on it, the worse it's going to get. The more you work on it, the better it will get. So I'm very, very confident when I recall Sydney now that he will come back and he'll do what I've asked of him. However, if you left it a year without any practice at all, I'd be less confident.
Yeah, think of the recall muscle. That's what you want to think of. Think of the recall as a recall muscle, and you want to make sure that it's as fit as it can possibly be. And the more time you put into strengthening that muscle, the better your recall is going to be. And if you don't ever go down the gym and you just eat loads of chocolate, your dog is not going to come back when you call it.
Well, that's more fun eating chocolate. So I think this is a big one. If you just let your dog off and then grab the phone out, like we were saying earlier on, your dog learns to check out as soon as you let the lead off.
Yeah, I mean, this for me is the anti-recall behaviour. This is exactly what you don't want.
Anti-recall training.
Anti-recall training, yeah. So literally, you're letting the dog off and you're completely disengaging from the dog, letting them go and do what they want. The first thing I would want, even before I let the dog off the lead, would be to give me some eye contact. Now you can come off the lead. You stay by me until I then release you to play. It's not about checking out.
And where possible, this starts with puppies. We've definitely included lots of exercises for trainers in our new puppy course with this sort of. Please start this at puppy class. You want to make sure that all your puppy owners are getting used to taking the clip off so that the dog is coming off the lead but is staying with the owners and giving eye contact, maybe practicing putting that lead back on and off a couple of times so that when they take their dog down the park and they unclip the lead, the dog's first default behaviour is to look at their owner and sit for the next cue rather than just legging it off down to go and chase squirrels, cats, ponies, dogs.
So I thought one of the most interesting points that Claire said at the beginning of this webinar was that many people wish they could rewind the clock and start again. Right, well, when you get your next puppy, definitely start earlier. But it's not too late.
Never too late.
If you've got a dog with a terrible recall, start training now.
Yeah, and train every day. It's a muscle, and yes, for some older dogs it might be harder to build those muscles, and for some people who have lived their life without doing any kind of training at all, it might be harder to start that off. But it's 100% worth it and totally doable. And
the final point from me on this one is about blurring the lines of when you're training your dog and when you're not. The outside world is your training ground. It's not where you go just to walk your dog, it's your training ground. You know, training your dog doesn't stop at the door. In fact, I'd argue it starts at the door.
So one of the biggest mistakes that people make is to only call their dog back at the very end of the walk. Now, the problem with that is that you can create an association, meaning recall equals end of the best part of their day. So my top tip is to call your dog back several times throughout their walk, reward them, and then let them off again.
So my top tip when it comes to teaching your dog a recall would be to really think about what your recall cue means. So when we say to our dog sit, it's very clear to the dog their bum has to touch the floor. But when we use a whistle, when we say come here Fido, often we don't actually have a particular behaviour that we're looking for the dog to do. So does it mean come in my vicinity? Does it mean move towards me? I think you're much better off teaching a dog a particular behaviour. So your recall could mean touch my hand, or it could mean come into a present position, or come into a heel position, or something specific so that you know what you're training your dog and when they've met criteria.
So the biggest problem that I see when I watch people train their dogs with recall is they've been to puppy class, they've been through the process of classically conditioning a whistle normally for recall, but then they take it outside and they forget to spice up the reinforcer a bit. So dog comes back a few times, gets his little bit of kibble and then runs off again. But spice it up, use something different. If your dog's chasing something, use a toy as reward, spice it all the way up so that they're getting that catch, they're getting that play, they're getting that effect of catching that rabbit when you've called them back off it. So spice it up a bit, guys.
It's been a real pleasure, but before we run away, I'm going to hand you back over to Claire, who's going to tidy up a few bits and pieces, I believe.
You make the assumption I do housework there, Nando. Great, thank you ever so much. That was really, really interesting, and quite a lot of food for thought there for all of us. So we're now going to move into some questions. We've already had some coming through, but if you've got other questions, then do type them into the chat box. And if it's okay with you guys, I'll just kick off with our first question, which is from Candy. And she says her recall's not too bad, but it could be better. And she recalls to either to a whistle or a sort of yodel sound. Whatever that might be. And she's kind of got two questions here. So Storm is her dog, and the first question that she's asking is that, and it's interesting because you did talk about this as one of your recall criteria, the speed that the dog comes back to you, but her dog thinks there's absolutely no rush to get back, just sort of trots along like he's got all the time in the world. And she's asking, how do you speed that up, or do you need to speed that up if he is coming back, but just not at a pace?
Well, it depends. It depends on what she wants her recall to be like. So for one of my dogs, for Blake, for his competition recall, it's really important that it's super duper speedy. And this might be a little bit of a controversial one because it is using negative punishment. But what I do is I put my ball out ready for him, and I call him back. And if he's super slow, the ball goes back behind my back again, and he doesn't get that reinforcement. But next time when he's quicker, he gets it.
I think it's a bit of dog dependent as well, because what I might do is I might make the reinforcer so good for coming back that it's more likely to motivate him more in the future to come back for the reward. So if it's the Candy with the Storm I'm thinking of, then it's another little mini American Shepherd. And I would say try using toys if you're using food. If Storm will only work for food, try making the food come alive and become interesting. So even if it's best steak, that doesn't mean you can't make him chase best steak when he gets back for it. It doesn't mean you can't throw it in the air for him to catch as he's on his way back. Those kinds of things.
What they said.
Great, thank you.
Really.
Sorry, I spoke over you there.
Oh, I just said, yeah, like Dean said, adding energy to that recall, it can make a difference.
Great. And then the second part of her question is that if he finds something to eat, naughty Storm, she's asking how he won't actually come back until he's actually finished eating it. So she's asking how would you train the dog to come back rather, mid-eat, shall we say. She says she's tried lots of lures, and he will actually leave it when he's told to, when he's on lead, just not when he's off lead. So
train it out of context. So get some food in the house, teach your dog a good solid leave it in the house, and then build that up over time. Clearly, the further away from you he is, the more likely he is to eat that food. So if you want control of your dog at 100 meters in terms of leaving food, then make sure you've trained it at 120 meters in the back garden or in a protected space.
So if you go to our YouTube channel, which is the School of Canine Science, there's 2 videos that you can find on there. One is the pre-mat recall, where I'm taking the mickey out of our good friend Jordan Shelley, but it will give you some very clear tips about how to get your dog away from distractions. And the second one is the leave it video. So it's basically teaching your dog to leave whatever it is that they're interested in, and then adding your recall after that.
okay, good, thank you. I think that's pretty interesting. If he leaves it when he's on lead, then obviously that's a distance that he can leave it from, but once he's off lead, then I guess the distance is
and it's context, Claire. So our dogs are master discriminators, so he will know whether he's on lead or not. So you just got to train the same behavior off lead, generalize that behavior.
Cool. Okay, so next question is from Katrina, and she's got a 5.5-year-old rescue lab who was adopted at 3 and didn't have much training. And I think this is a common problem actually. He's good in obedience classes, he recalls fine in classes, but that doesn't transfer into the big wide world. And he's particularly, well, she's particularly attracted by cats, dogs, food, fox poo, and all types of wildlife. Just about anything, she adds then. She says that no high-value treats would tempt the dog back from a mad dash towards a distraction, and particularly running up to other dogs is a problem, as she wasn't that well socialized, so a bit hit and miss now. So there's a question there about, how you sort of train that bit, and I think you have talked a little bit about that, about the distraction from other dogs. But I think also the other interesting thing is where dogs will recall fine in classes, but then it's transferring that into the big wide world, really.
So I think some of that is about bringing your distractions into your class. So I remember wandering around when I used to work with Shurag Patel, who's a friend of ours, at Company of Animals. I remember us wandering around a field for about half an hour before a class once, picking up fox poo and bringing it so that we could bring it in class as a distraction. So I think taking those real life distractions into a class situation just blurs those lines, which I think is really important.
Yeah, I think again it's sometimes using that distraction as the reward. Maybe not the fox poo, because it's rather stinky, but if you've got something like, for instance, chasing is your problem, then try using chasing like a flirt pole as your reward. It's trying to match that level of currency, of doggy currency, rather than trying to pay 50 quid.
And as the guy said earlier as well, using that recalling off other dogs and then releasing the dog onto the other dogs to play can be brilliant, because otherwise what we can do if we are frustrated that our dog doesn't usually come back from other dogs is that when he does come back from other dogs, we stick him on the lead and walk in the other direction, because we think finally he's actually done it. And so we can punish him for coming back. So it's really important that every time he comes back, he's not then, it doesn't result in the lead going on and going home, but actually that you can release him back onto the dog.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that applies to not just the dog situation, but recall in general. For every 3 times I use my recall cue, I'm probably put my dog on the lead once. Okay, so if you need to do it that first time, that's fine, but make sure you practice that recall cue again a couple of times on the session, on the walk, where you then let your dog go off and be another dog again, or you give him a little bit of training afterwards. So you don't want to punish the dog for coming back. And
you get that on all of the time, don't you? You get even dog trainers punish their recalls accidentally. Like the dog's out in the garden, they say Fluff comes running in with some gusto, you give them a treat that's the value of £5, but then you stick eye drops in their eyes. And that's, you've just taken 50 quid out the bank there. So that ends up building this context. So they might come in from the garden, but then at the end of your walk they won't go to the car, because you've built this context of, if I'm holding my lead, you're going to go in and it's going to be the end of the walk. So all of these things have got to be thought out, but that's what a dog trainer's job is to work out a plan for you, so that you can get to your end goal quickly and efficiently.
Yeah, but just think of it on a scale. So like on an old-fashioned scale, so that every time that you are pulling your dog away from other dogs or pulling them away from squirrels, or you need to make sure that equally you're giving them that good stuff as well, or actually more so, because then they'll come back.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I think that also answers Paula's question. She walks a couple of dogs who are great in training when it's just her and the dogs, but then immediately bolt off if they see another dog. So I think you've probably covered that in the presentation and your previous answer. And I think the other thing that certainly came out for me in the presentation was that the very first bit of your recall training actually doesn't involve a dog, does it? Because you've got to sit down and think about your criteria and your cues and your rewards and everything like that. So it's almost doing that planning before you start training the dog.
That can definitely be certainly for certain people. For me, I like to really think about things and then plan them and then do them, because otherwise if you end up going out there and just trying it and messing around with it, you don't end up with the results that you've envisioned.
Yeah, was it Bob Bailey that said, think, plan, do them in that order, and don't do them in any other order. So think about what you want, plan how you're going to get it, and then go and do it. Don't do any of them at the same time, and don't do them in any other order.
If you do have problems, though, sometimes planning is the sticky point. I know a lot of dog trainers that have no idea how to plan. So sometimes it's really difficult as a dog owner how to get from A to B, but if you find a trainer that knows their stuff, that's their skill set. That's what
I think it's 80% of the trainer's job is breaking down and converting what you want into what works for the dog. The incremental steps where you can set the owner and the dog up for success.
And something we're always asked is, well, how do I know that the trainer can do it? How do I know that he's a good trainer? And I suppose my answer would probably fall under ask your trainer to send you a video of the dog recalling, of their dog recalling, because it's really important for recall. It's one of those behaviours that it's just important that you get a trainer who can teach that behaviour, can do it practically.
Good advice. Wow. Okay, good. So another question, this one's from Carol, is what's the best way to help a rescue dog that is terrified of loud noises, so presumably runs off if they hear a loud noise?
I would book a secure field to start with, so that dog is getting a nice opportunity to have some safe time for enrichment and to build up their confidence around being outside with their owner, especially if they're a rescue dog and they, depending on how long she's had the dog for, they need to you want to build up the relationship between the dog and the owner, so that the owner is a real secure base for that dog, so that being next to the owner is super, 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 super safe. So that then when the owner does take the dog and begin to gradually take them into more different environments with more different sounds, they can use the relationship with the owner as a way of coming forward and back from safety. The other thing I'd say is make sure you teach a dialogue so that the dog can make it very, very clear when it's too much, so that you can judge properly when something is just exposing the dog to something that's a little bit uncomfortable, or when you're putting your dog through something that's actually quite traumatic. Because you're going to have to put that dog through some uncomfortable noises in order for them to desensitize to those noises. But what you don't want to do into trauma, otherwise they're not going to change their behavior. It's going to be too much for the dog. But ultimately, get a really decent behaviorist in. You're going to need help with that one, I think.
Yeah,
Great.
that is a tricky one. So here's a question from Julie, and that is, do you have a certain recall when you're walking multiple dogs?
Yeah, we have one that means kind of like gang come here. It's like I can't remember that cartoon that I've got the button and they'll come in for a meeting. But
What?
But it's is it in the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles?
Just leave
I
it.
can't
Just
remember.
leave it.
Anyway, so yeah, we do. We have pup, and when we say pup, that's kind of like telling the whole gang they all need to assemble.
But your criteria for that might be looser than come back for a hand touch. It might be just come back in front of us in proximity for some food or something along those lines.
It usually means we're going to scatter feed them.
We have the Batman logo light that goes up into the clouds, and they all descend from Gotham.
Yeah.
Too far?
Too far.
Okay.
I guess it's important to train that as well, where you've got your emergency command, particularly when you've got a number of dogs out there.
Also, I think when you get a second dog, so if you've already got a dog with an established recall and you get a second dog, so let's say you've trained it on whistle and you're then going through the process of classically conditioning that whistle in the house for the second dog, just be wary of the fact that you're working on extinction with the first dog, and that dog's not getting necessarily reinforced for it coming back, and it's hearing the whistle and the whistle sort of turning into white noise. So make sure that you continue to reinforce the first dog's recall really strongly if you're going to use the same cue. I guess the counter to that is train a different cue.
What's brilliant though about having a one cue for all the dogs is that there is a level of competition for the dogs to come back, especially if you do something like scatter feeding. Scatter feeding tends to be one of those things that, generally speaking, even if you have dogs that are a little bit resource guardy, for some reason dogs, because none of the scattered food doesn't particularly belong to anybody, you don't get that resource guarding behaviour. So generally, if we're training that, we'll shout pup pup, and then we'll chuck a load of food on the floor, and there's that competition value, which definitely increases speed as well, which can be lovely.
Really true, but just to be on the safe side, when we talk about scatter feeding, we're talking about throwing small, tiny treats and numerous of them. Don't throw 3 chicken carcasses on the floor if you've got 7 dogs.
Yeah, that doesn't count.
That's not what we're talking about.
Yeah, I know my shepherd always comes back on my staffy's name because she knows there's some goodies to have there. So you got a nice bit of competition.
Yeah.
So here's a good question from Dawn about deaf dog recall. Do you have any tips for a deaf dog recall when he's facing away from me?
Yes, I would use a vibration collar. I've used the vibration collars with deaf dogs before, and you can condition that with a very low level vibration to have a really positive emotional response. So putting it on the lowest level of the vibration and feed, so the dog feels really good about that. So the dog knows that when they feel that vibration, food is coming from mum or play is coming from mum. For me, that's been the best, most successful way of training a deaf dog to recall, because you can do that at any distance and when the dog isn't looking.
Would you train the collar for recall, or would you train it for pay attention to me? Is it for use other visual signals?
I've trained it for recall in the past, but absolutely, there's no reason why you couldn't train it like that.
Yeah, because I presume you still do the whole planning with the criteria and everything, even for a deaf dog. It's just some of the signals will be different, and using the collar or something like that will be different.
Yeah, it's all exactly the same in terms of kind of like the underpinning, the science underpinning, and the practicalities. You just got to think outside the box. And I always try and think tactile rather than visual, because when dogs get old, their vision does tend to become more impaired. And actually, you find that a lot of the breeds and pigment problems that can lead to deafness also leads to premature blindness. And so you're better off having tactile things, so like taps on the shoulder, meaning clicks and treats, rather than a visual cue of a thumb up or something, because I think that's got much better longevity.
Interesting, good advice. So now another question. We haven't got a name for this, but they said, how do you practice recall with a dog that is too strong for you on a long line?
Secure field is one option. So hire somewhere where you know the dog's going to be safe, but you get the opportunity to practice it. Or
start in the house.
Or
start in the garden.
Yeah, start in the house.
Or get a big dog trainer. Get a big dog trainer, and I'm not even kidding, really. So I really do think there's a massive. We don't utilise dog trainers as they should be utilised sometimes. I think that certainly if I was an owner and not a dog trainer, when it comes to my car being fixed or something, I know it's not quite the same, but I'm going to send him away to a professional, my car, and then he's going to be fixed, and then he's going to come back and they're going to say, there you go, that's fixed. You need to press this button and the lights are going to come on. And I know that dogs aren't robots, and I know that we have to obviously treat them as sentient beings, but I don't see why, especially with recall, when you've got a dog that you really are struggling to handle, or if you're being a bit outdogged, or if you have a dog that does have much more predation than you expected, get someone who can come in and do it for you, take all the stress off you, and show you when your dog's sorted, when your dog has a decent recall, how to recall that dog back so you're not having to use a long line.
I think the other point that I'd make on that is think carefully about what your recall criteria is. If your dog is that strong that they can pull you over, maybe don't choose a flying hand touch as your recall criteria. Or the dog probably stopping or even shooting past you and then heeling around you rather than trying to barge through your legs or something along those lines.
Yeah, I have that problem a little bit with my Mally, because I train him to run through in between my legs when I call him. And he's massive, and I'm a tiny little 5'1" woman. So sometimes the results can be a little bit hilarious.
I'm a tiny little 5'1" woman as well.
Moving on. Actually, I think that's a really interesting point about the recall being one thing that people could get another trainer to train for them, because it is one thing that people do struggle with, and maybe that's something that a lot of trainers haven't maybe thought about, that certainly that specific behaviour could be trained by someone else successfully, rather than having to resort to use punishment-based methods, I guess.
Why I like the whistle, Claire, because it means any member of the family can take it out and mean the same thing to the dog. It's not reliant on Nando going pop pop and me going pop pop. It's, well, they would be different things to the dog.
Yeah. So another question here. This is a good one. So when scent is the major distraction for a dog, how can you use it for a reward?
So firstly, there's a couple of different ways. One is either to use it as to harness the power of scent and teach the dog nose work, because you'll find that the attention that you get from your dog in the first place will improve massively. Nose work is enormously underutilized when it comes to anything. But you can also teach, if there's specific scents that your dog is distracted by, you can teach a leave it, but to a certain smell. Okay, so again, a lot of the exercises that we do in dog training classes aren't based around the way that a dog perceives the world. They're based around the way that a human perceives the world. And we know that dogs have this enormous sense of smell. So if they smell something in particular, you can teach that to be a signal to give you attention. So whenever they smell fox poo, they look at you. And then you can call them away, or you can call them to come to you, or do a behaviour which is mutually exclusive to rolling around in fox poo.
Also, I remember Ian Dunbar a while ago releasing these little puffer things where they actually use the scent as the reinforcer.
Oh, yeah.
So he had a little puffer thing whereby he would say yes and mark the dog, and then puff the air of the scent that the dog liked to the dog. So the dog actually was reinforced by the smell. But I don't think they ever took off, and I think they discontinued them. Sorry to put down on things there.
We were all just getting excited there at that concept.
Looking for it. Where is it?
Are you guys good for a couple more questions?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So here's one there. Someone says, my dog isn't food or toy motivated. What can I do to get him to come back?
Anyone wants like this?
Well, it depends. if there's something that's motivating your dog to stay away, use that as your distraction. We go straight back to our pre-MAC principle. Get yourself on YouTube, search School of Canine Science, pre-MAC principle, and there'll be a full-length 5-minute video of me dressed ridiculously, but talking you through how you work your dog to come away from distractions. It's called the pre-MAC principle, and it's thoroughly interesting.
It's also worth having a little think about a trainer in your area, and it's also worth thinking about why your dog isn't food motivated or toy motivated. For example, are they food and toy motivated in the house, and actually then out of the house, are they actually too many other things going on that they can't even think about taking food or playing with toys?
I think sometimes as well we have a real preconceived notion of what play is. So a lot of people think play is throwing a ball and the dog fetching it, or play is playing tuggy. And there's 100 million different combinations of behaviours that the dog could do, which they interpret as play. So, for example, I know a golden retriever who likes to rip up tissues, and for that golden retriever, that is definitely what they do to play. It's part of their kind of I don't want to call it predatory action sequence, but it's part of plucking behaviour that they find really reinforcing. So when you think about what your dog does enjoy doing, I'm sure there will be some aspects of that you can use to then tailor your play. Play doesn't have to be throwing a ball or tugging on a tuggy. Play can be giving the dog something to dissect, like Dean talked about earlier, or simply getting the dog to hold something in its mouth.
What about affection?
Yeah, and affection.
Yeah, affection depends. I mean, there's so many variables that you could look at. Yeah, I mean, we could go even simpler than that. Is your dog not motivated by food because he's a big fatty fat? And or is it that your dog's not motivated by food because you're taking out really boring treats? You know, yeah. There's lots of things we've got to look at to double check as to why they're not motivated by food.
And as always, it might be worth getting a little vet check to make sure that the lack of motivation isn't something linked to like the thyroid or any chemistry that might be making the dog feel a little bit, you know, lethargic.
And if you do want a dog that's motivated by food, then get a Labrador.
Well, there we go.
You're always bitching about Labradors.
I'm not. I love Labradors. I actually love Labradors. They're one of my favourite dogs.
Yeah, they're probably also the hardest ones to get away from any grotty old food on the floor, though. So it works both ways, doesn't it? So here's an interesting question. So if you're using tugging as reinforcement for the recall, what about the dog who has conflict issues in that you tugging would take him over threshold? Would there be any other options for that?
Are we talking about a dog that is then grabbing arms and grabbing stuff that they shouldn't be
grabbing? And just getting over the top by the sounds of it.
Yeah, I think that tugging is a fantastic game. It has to be taught right. You have to teach it at home before you take it out on a walk and use it as reinforcement. And I think that tugging doesn't just mean tug, 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 tug. I think that tugging, especially at the beginning, means kind of like 30 seconds tugging, out, sit, a little bit more tugging, out, sit. It's not all the tugging bit is going to bring the arousal up. So you have to add in some control there as well. Tugging's brilliant, but it has to be played right.
Maybe not even 30 seconds. It could be one tug if the dog finds tug reinforcing, and then ownership of the item. I think the other thing is you could use something like a flirt pole, whereby the dog gets to come in and get an element of tug, an element of restriction against the toy being pulled, but without it being right next to you, and you being the reason that they have to let go of the toy.
The other thing that I would say as well, sorry, Nando, to tease Rosie, is that a lot of dogs we think love tugging actually just want to possess an item, and that can lead to real conflict. So just make sure that your dog, when you're letting go of the item, is orientating back towards you with the item to initiate more play, and they're not buggering off with it and trying to destroy it. Because if they're buggering off with it and trying to destroy it, it's more likely that the dog wants to possess than he actually wants to tug.
So the other thing I would say when it comes to tug as well, that sometimes you create conflict because you're too heavy going with the dog, or we think that actually the dog loves playing tug, but they also have a little bit too much guardian instinct, so they want to get away from you. So what you can do is actually tie a lead to your tug toy, still play tug, but they're a meter away from you, so there's less pressure involved. And just turning your body and doing different things. There's a friend of ours called Craig Ogilvie who has a book called The Interactive Play Guide. It's well worth read if you're
Struggling with
if you're
play.
if you're struggling with play.
Or actually, he does workshops all around the country, so I'm
Yeah.
sure if you look online, you'll be able to find one close.
He's a good
to you.
lad. He's worth checking out.
Yeah, his play stuff's great.
Thank you. So here's one from Julie. She's they've got 2 dogs that have got very high chase issues. Both are in the same family. They're both Greek Street Rescues. That's not easy to say. One small terrier cross, the other is a mastiff cross. And the question is really, would it be better to work individually with the owners at separate times, or to work with both of them at the same time?
In a word, yes. Individually, definitely.
Individually.
Yeah.
Without no
100%.
question, no
Yeah, yeah.
question.
Work. It's that think, plan, do thing. Your planning part here is to work each dog individually until they can both do it very well, and then you start introducing them together.
And that goes for pretty much all training, unless the actual training that you're doing requires the dogs to be working together. Generally speaking, all training, if you've got siblings, if you've got multiple dogs, do it separately and then bring the dogs together.
Yeah, you just can't focus on the criteria with 2 dogs at the same time anywhere near as well as you can focus on one.
Yeah.
We're not that good at multitasking.
Nope.
Well, I guess you're kind of setting the dogs up to fail as well, aren't you, really?
Yeah, and yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. Here's a cute one. So Dusty, sounds cute. This is from Vicky. Dusty has an amazing recall on a walk, but how do I get her in from my garden? She sits at the door.
Not putting eye drops in her eyes.
She sits at the door like a stubborn pig, and I play a game of opening and shutting the door. So that's quite interesting. Great recall out there, but can't get her in from the garden.
Get a dog flap.
Well, consequence is the simple answer. What has been the consequence of coming in from the garden? The consequence of coming in from the garden is the door gets shut because I needed you in so I can go upstairs and we can sit and watch TV together or whatever it might be. But the dog wants to be in the garden. So I'd focus on the first time you get that dog back in, I'd open the door and go, hey, let's go and play again, take a ball out, go and play with them for a bit, and then come back in and practice letting the dog back out into the garden as part of the reward for coming back in.
The other thing I'd remember is that the dinner bowl and the noise of dinner going in the dinner bowl has a really, really strong history of reinforcement. There's nothing to say that the dog can only have 2 dinners a day. You can split the portion of food into 6 or 7 and do the same little food thing, so that when you're calling your dog in 6 times during the day, they're coming in for food in their bowl as if they're having 6 dinners, each one for when the dog comes in.
But if it was me playing that game, I'd still leave the door open. So I'd let the dog eat out the bowl, and then you can go back outside, mate. It's fine. Thank you for coming.
So you'd use a protocol called Nuku Olku with that as well. So you'd say, Fluffy, come, and then you would rattle the dinner bowl so that eventually, when you shout Fluffy, come, the dog comes flying in.
Great. Hope that helps them, Vicky. So Andy asks, what is the best way to train a dog a successful recall away from wildlife when the dog has previously been successful in chasing and catching wildlife?
So you're going to be looking at massive stages of predation. We've got a whole 2-day instructor's course on this. So trying to answer it in 5 minutes is really difficult because that needs to be picked apart. But first and foremost is management, not allowing the dog to perform the behavior that you don't like. The second part is focusing on what part of the predatory motor pattern is the predatory action sequence, which is kicking off getting the wildlife, and also what wildlife it is. Is it scent that's starting that off? Is it the motion that's starting it off? There's various different beats that you look at. So it's a really difficult question to answer without more detail. Yeah, without loads more detail and without actually kind of tearing that apart. But if you're struggling with it and you're either in the US or you're in the UK, send us a message and we will point you in the direction of one of our instructors that has done our predation course, and they'll be able to help you out.
Great, and I've been on that predation course and I can thoroughly recommend it.
Or just call Claire. Or just call Claire.
Yeah,
Well, you'll be impressed actually, because I was doing some training with Sprout. We did a little video live, Facebook Live, to advertise the webinar, and I was doing the thing with the whip it with him, where he was leaving the squirrel on the end of the whip thing, and then chasing it. So we actually learnt something too. So there we go.
It's super fun. Those predatory exercises on that workshop are some of my faves.
There's lots you can do.
So much. When you understand predation, it unlocks a whole different window into it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it is great fun, and it makes it great fun around, pseudo wildlife things, but coming back and leaving it is the fun bit. And actually, on that subject, here's a quick one from Kate. I was going to do 2 more questions. Is that okay? And then wrap it up?
Go for it.
All right. So this is from Katie, and she said, I've been working on recall from wildlife with my terrier, who has a high chase done with a long line and a whistle. It's been really difficult for him, but we are making progress. Hooray. At the moment, my criteria is to come back to within touching distance, get his reward, food or chase or tug, and stay with me until I say okay. Should I be more defined with the criteria for when he comes back, e.g. middle or touch? And also, I've been working on the principle of not letting him practice the behaviour of chasing wildlife. So I was interested in Nando's use of the chasing as reward. Could this actually make the chasing worse if done incorrectly?
Yeah, it totally can do. If you do it badly, it will make your chasing worse, 100%. And you've got to make sure that it's ethical, because you can't, if your dog is a rabbit killer, you can't use the chasing and killing of rabbits as a reward without upsetting a lot of rabbits and people.
Sounds like to me though, she's doing a brilliant job already.
Yeah, it does sound like you're doing good. If you're making progress.
In terms of changing your criteria, it really is up to you. That's the beautiful thing about criteria. If you're happy with your dog coming within arm's reach, and that's what you want it to look like, then so long as you're consistent, the dog will get it in the end.
Yeah, as long as you're clear and consistent.
Yeah, what I would say about just having proximity as criteria, as in how close or far the dog is from you, is that it's probably hard for the dog to recognise that. So you're probably looking at you doing a lot more consistent reps before the dog understands precisely what you want. Whereas if you have a foot touch, you said it's Jack Russell, I think. So if you have like a foot touch or a middle position or something, I do think those behaviours are easier for the dog to understand because it's very clear, and B, easier for you to practice, not in a recall situation, so that you can build a really high history of reinforcement. It's hard to practice reinforcing proximity in your kitchen because the dog's near you most of the time anyway. It's much easier to practice reinforcing them for a middle position or a touch out of contact to build that history.
This is one of the reasons I quite like tricks as part of a recall, because we spend more time training them because they're fun. So therefore they've got a higher history of reinforcements. We practice them more. We show our friends them. They're exciting to do. So if you add that in as one of your recall criteria, the dog's going to love it.
Yeah. I do have to reiterate what Dean said though. If you're making progress on any of this chasing wildlife stuff, you're doing a very good job, because it's not easy. Depending on the type of dog that you've got, if you've got a really high, I'm going to say high drive dog, then it can be tough. If your dog is very predatory, it can be really, really difficult. So good job. Keep up the good work.
Good job. Don't change too much. We love you as well.
Sounds like it's going really well. So final question is from Nikki. And she said, my dog is an only child and goes running over to other dogs on a walk. I guess that's a bit of a problem when you've got a single dog. So he's got better at not trying to make them play, but how can I stop him bounding over in the first place? In other situations, he's pretty good at recall for dried fish or his squeaky toy, but he's a lurcher, so he can accelerate really quickly from a standing start.
So I'm gonna go first. I guess we'll all probably have one tip on this. So my tip would be a rule of 3. So only allow him to play with 1 out of 3 dogs that you meet on a walk. So for the other 2, either clip him on a lead, or if you can manage him just by feeding right next to you. And what this is about is it's about lowering expectations. because dogs can learn a context where they have very high expectations of other dogs and play. So what your dog might be learning is that when we are out and about together, whenever I see a dog, I get to go and play with it. And those high expectations are going to drive his behaviour and teach him what to do. So if we change that expectation so that he actually says, you know what, I might meet it, I might not, but if I don't, cool stuff happens with mum, then you're kind of changing the expectations of the dog, and that's definitely going to help his behaviour.
So I'd say train around dogs at a distance to begin with. So if it's sit stay for a few seconds with the dog in vision and that dog is 60, 70 meters away, work on that, and then work on it at 60, work on it at 50, work on it at 40, and train some really strong default behaviors: eye contact, sit stays, heel position.
And you could use the other dogs as a reinforcer.
Absolutely, yeah. And then you could release eventually, if you wanted to.
The behaviour's good. Yeah.
I think another thing to think about is doggy daycare, because some dog daycares are really, really well run and some are appalling. Okay, they're not all the same. And some dogs will love them and some dogs will hate them. But what it does do occasionally is build up this expectation that when they see another dog, they lift their arousal really, really quickly and expect to engage in the type of play that they might engage in at doggy daycare.
Yeah.
And if it's inappropriate and they go bounding over to a dog they don't know and engage the way that they do at doggy daycare, it can get them in all kinds of trouble. So just make sure, if you are using a facility like that, that it's run appropriately.
So one last little tip on that would also be that if you're finding it hard to do some of the stuff that Dean recommended and some of the stuff that I recommended and some of the stuff that Nando recommended, then it might be worth finding a friend dog to really saturate your dog in play with before you train them around other dogs.
Yes, especially if they're an only dog.
Yeah, you can. It's quite a good idea to knacker them out, give them a good old play with, you know, Max Labrador down the road who we plays with regularly, and then do that training so that you've already kind of got some of that real need to play out of the system.
Fantastic. Brilliant, thank you. Well, we've run out of questions, but some really great questions there from everybody as well. So thank you all, and thank you for sticking with us. We've got a good number of people who have stayed, so clearly a lot of people very interested in the subject and the content that you've given us. Just a couple of links up here. If you want to engage with the School of Canine Science, that's their website, and that will also take you through to their Facebook page. And if you've got any other questions that haven't been answered, or they come to you just as you're falling asleep, which is usually when my questions come to me, by all means ask some questions on their Facebook page, and Jo, Rosie, Nando and Dean have kindly said they will they will respond to the questions as well, so feel free to ask, because you know, this is a subject that I think we've been given a lot of food for thought tonight. National Welfare Trust's website is on there, and also we've got a recall advice sheet which covers quite a lot of actually what was talked about today, thankfully, which is there as well if you want to use that link to access that. So all that remains for me to do is to say a huge thank you to Nando, Jo, Rosie and Dean for a really fascinating webinar. I think there's all been bits where we've gone, oh, that's interesting, I hadn't thought about that. So thank you so much, guys, for your input there. That's been really brilliant. And thank you everybody for your questions as well. I think we've had some really interesting discussions. No apologies for the thank you, and no apologies for the shameless last page. Obviously NAWT is funded completely by donations, so if you did find this webinar useful and you would like to make a donation to the National Animal Welfare Trust to help with our work, then here is how you can do it. And if you do make a donation, thank you very much indeed. I think after this you get a little feedback questionnaire. If there are any other subjects that you would be interested in hearing webinars about, then let us know and we'll see what we can arrange. We do these from time to time. And so just remains to say thank you for listening, and huge thanks to our panelists. You've been absolutely amazing.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us, Claire.
It's a pleasure.